They say the wind never truly stops blowing on the frontier. It carries voices from the past, secrets from the hills, and sometimes, the prayers of those too proud to beg. If you're watching this, it means you're drawn to stories that stir the soul, stories that reach across time, reminding us of what it means to be human. If you're new here, hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with us till the end, because this one will stay with you long after the dust settles. The year was 1883. And the land, rough and untamed, had long since forgotten what laughter sounded like. On a stretch of land carved between the dry canyons and cedar-covered hills of New Mexico, lived a man named Silas Boon. Silas wasn't young anymore. The silver in his beard had taken over long ago, and his bones groaned when he woke. But he wasn't weak. No, Silas was the kind of man who endured. His hands were still strong, calloused from years of working the land, raising cattle, building fences, burying his pain. They called him the Silent Bull in the nearby town, and not just because he didn't say much. He hadn't always been this way. There was once a woman named Lila. His heart, his fire. And there was a little girl too, Ella. Until a fever swept through like a thief in the night and stole them both before sunrise. That was 15 winters ago. Since then, Silas had kept only the company of his dog, Moses, and the sunrise that came up like a lonely ember each morning. The ranch was simple, functional. He'd built every board himself, no hired hands, no neighbors within miles. Just a man and his ghosts. Until one evening in late October, when the wind didn't bring the usual chill, it brought footsteps. 10 of them. Moses barked like the devil himself had arrived, and Silas stepped out on his porch with his Winchester leveled. What he saw froze him mid-breath. 10 Apache souls stood at the edge of his corral, 5 women, 3 young boys, and 2 wounded men. They didn't speak at first. Their faces were hollow, sun-scorched and tight with exhaustion. The eldest of them, a woman with a braided shawl and proud, fire-dark eyes, stepped forward. "We do not come to steal," she said, voice low. "We come because we have nowhere else to go." Silas didn't lower his gun. She didn't flinch. Then one of the boys, barely 10, collapsed in the dirt. His lips were cracked and bleeding. That was the moment something inside Silas cracked. Not broke, cracked just enough for the light to begin leaking in. He didn't say a word. Just stepped down, picked the boy up in his arms, and turned toward the house. The next few days were filled with tension like a loaded rifle. Silas slept with one eye open, his rifle leaning against the bed. But slowly, routine crept in. The women took to cleaning and cooking, using herbs and skills Silas had never seen. The children fed the animals and patched old fences. The wounded men, once they could walk, helped with the cattle drives. There were no conversations. Only nods, short glances, and the occasional grunt. But there was something else too, an unspoken peace growing in the silences between them. On the 5th day, Silas finally asked what had brought them here. The elder woman, whose name was Neal, told him in halting English about a raid on their village. Soldiers. Retaliation, they said, for a nearby settler ambush the Apache had nothing to do with. The few who survived had scattered into the desert like leaves in a storm. These 10 had walked for 3 days without food or water. Silas listened without blinking. Then he said, "You can stay. Through winter. Longer, if need be." The look Neal gave him wasn't one of thanks, it was one of understanding. She saw the pain behind his silence. The guilt he carried for not being able to save his family. In her own way, she'd buried children too. Seasons passed. Snow blanketed the ranch, and for the first time in years, the house was full of warmth, of stories whispered in Apache, of laughter over stew, of shared grief healing quietly beside a fire. The children began calling Silas, Grandfather Bull. He never corrected them. But peace never stays long on stolen land. One morning in spring, 3 U.S. cavalry riders arrived at the ranch gate. They asked about Apache fugitives. Said they'd tracked footprints into the canyon and figured the savages were hiding nearby. They eyed the ranch house with suspicion, seeing unfamiliar patterns in the smoke from the chimney. Silas stood tall, alone, arms crossed. "You see any Apaches, Boon?" The officer asked, chewing tobacco and squinting at the barn. No, Silas said, without flinching. They're dangerous. Killed a family of settlers near Fort Sumner. Orders are shoot on sight. Silas's jaw twitched. The soldiers lingered too long. One dismounted. Started circling the barn. And that's when one of the Apache boys, curious and innocent, peeked from the loft window. It was over in a flash. Sir, movement in the hayloft. The officer raised his rifle, but Silas was faster. He stepped in front of the shot, leveled his own Winchester, and barked, "This is my land. They are my people now. You fire that gun, you answer to me." The standoff burned cold. A long breath of tension between life and death. The officer spat again. Looked around. Calculated the cost of blood. Then turned his horse and rode off. You just made enemies in high places, the youngest soldier warned before galloping away. When Silas turned back to the barn, the boy in the loft was crying. Silas walked over, lifted him down gently, and said, "You're safe now. I promise." That night, the whole house gathered in silence, watching the moon rise. No one spoke of what had happened, but everyone knew. Something had changed. The ranch wasn't just land anymore. It was home. And Silas Boon wasn't alone anymore. Years later, when Silas passed quietly in his sleep at age 72, he was buried on the hill above the house, next to a stone carved by Niall herself. It read, "He gave us shelter. We gave him family." And every spring, when the winds blew through the canyons just right, you could hear children's laughter echoing off the hills, and somewhere, maybe just in your heart, you could hear the low bark of an old dog named Moses. If this story moved you, like it, share it, and subscribe. Because stories like these remind us that no matter how broken a man may be, kindness, when it comes quietly, humbly, and in need, can still bring him back to life.